there. I'm your host, Leslie Randolph. I'm a self-confidence coach for teenage girls and the self-confidence coach you wish you had as a teen. Honestly, I'm the self-confidence coach I wish I had as a teen because I know I could have saved myself and my mother a whole lot of heartache if I'd only known then what I know now. I hope to save you some of that suffering by sharing the lessons I learned late in life right here on Why Didn't They Tell Us? Welcome to the show.
Hey, happy people. Welcome back to Why Didn't They Tell Us? Ooh, I am excited for today's episode. So today's show is coming out as we close out October, which is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. I'm very passionate about this topic, and I've also been personally affected by it with a sister who was diagnosed about 1.5 years ago. So around this time last year, I welcomed my amazing sister Laura to the show to share her story of lessons learned from a diagnosis. And to date, 1 year later, it has been the most downloaded episode of the podcast, and also I think the most resonant, because people have literally stopped me out in the world to ask about Laura, to quote Laura to me. This has happened multiple times. It actually happened on the show. I had a guest that came on the show and then quoted Laura to me. People shared their care and concern for her, and they also shared their own story. This means more than I can say personally, and professionally. It reminds me of what happens when we are willing to be vulnerable and put ourselves out there to share our stories, to share our gifts, to share our pain, our possibility, our purpose, our hope. So I wanted to continue the conversation this year, but to look at it from another angle. My sister's story was about this incredible mindset to get her through a diagnosis and treatment, but there's a lot more on the other side of that as well. And today's guest is going to help me talk a bit about that. Samantha Golkin is an attorney in private practice in New York City. Among her many credentials, Samantha holds a master's in applied positive psychology and a BA from the University of Pennsylvania, a JD from Seton Hall Law School, and an LLM in real estate from New York Law School. Samantha is an 11-year breast cancer survivor and serves as the vice president of the Pink Agenda and co-chair of the organization's education committee, where she leads advocacy efforts to educate young professionals about the disease and how they can make a positive impact in the fight against breast cancer. A huge proponent on well-being interventions to reduce risk of the disease and or quality of life during treatment and survivorship, Samantha has appeared on MSNBC and Fox 5 New York and has served as a Huffington Post contributor, speaking and writing about health, wellness, and living your best life. Samantha, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
No, the pleasure is mine, and I'm so thankful that you're lending your voice to us and sharing your story. So there's a lot of living in that bio that I just read, but tell us what got you here to being this advocate and this voice for breast cancer.
Well, it's a long road that spanned about 30 years, but the short story is I was diagnosed with breast cancer when I was 30 years old, and my journey didn't start there. My journey started when I was about 6. My mom had actually been diagnosed with breast cancer. She was 33 when she was diagnosed. She was diagnosed 2 weeks after my little brother was born. She had inflammatory breast cancer, which is a type of breast cancer that forms in the breast as a rash rather than a lump. A little different than what we normally know as breast cancer. And she was the most positive person that I have ever known. She lived life in a way that is really enviable, particularly in light of such a horrible diagnosis at a time when you are supposed to be celebrating life with new life. And she was really an example that I lived my life by. And unfortunately, she passed away when she was 35, 2 years after her diagnosis, but she fought. And as a 5 to 7 year old child, I didn't know that there was a problem. I knew mommy was sick, but I didn't really know the extent of it because she always had a smile on her face. She always told jokes. She was very funny. And that's really how I started on this journey. So I've always lived a life with positivity around me, and with really strong parents who gave me the tools that I needed to succeed. And my dad is a young father with 3 children and a wife that passed away. He really wanted us to keep in mind our health and wellness as we got older, knowing that we did have risk of breast cancer in our family now. And he always told me to keep an eye on my body, knowing what was going on with it, identify changes. So as a teenager, things change in your body. You're kind of scared of what's going on. You don't know. But I knew if there was something going on, I needed to tell somebody. And I shouldn't be afraid of that, because these changes are normal and they might not be a problem, but we still want to be on top of our health. And I lived by that throughout my teens and early 20s. And around 23 years old, I started getting my mammograms. And my mammograms were supposed to be annual, and they were supposed to be accompanied by a sonogram. And I had a very amazing breast specialist who prescribed me my mammogram appointment. She gave me my prescription to go to the radiology center, and she was always my best. She was a great advocate, telling me what I needed to do. I called up the radiology center. I made those appointments, and they called me shortly after and said, "Sorry, you're 23 years old. We're not going to screen you. Make an appointment when you're older. You're not covered by insurance." To me, I'm like, my gosh, I'm here supposed to advocate for my health, supposed to be aware of changes, supposed to be on top of what's going on in my body. And I have the powers that be saying, no, you're too young. You have no genetic mutations that are known. We're not going to screen you. And I could have just slumped over and said, you know what, okay, no problem. You know better than me. Or I could have advocated for myself. And that's what I did. And so throughout my 20s, anytime I got shut down, I called. I was very, very strong-willed, and I got those appointments. And I was talking to the sympathetic radiologist when I was about 28 years old, saying, this shouldn't be so hard. I just want to live a good life, and I want to know that I'm healthy.
Yeah.
And she suggested joining the high-risk surveillance program, the RISE program at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And after looking into it, I applied, and I had my first appointment with Dr. Mangino, who runs the program. She gave me a baseline MRI, and that baseline MRI came back clear. I got a letter. It said, looks good. And that was in about June. In August, I got my first MRI. Now, an MRI is a screening tool that is used for people who are of elevated risk. I had never gotten it before because my insurance company wasn't covering mammograms, and I was fortunate enough to be able to cover that out of pocket. But they certainly were not going to be covering an MRI, and I was in no position to spend thousands of dollars as a young law student or post-grad taking this very intensive screening that wasn't necessarily recommended for people my age without risk.
Sure.
But I ultimately went in for that, and they saw something, and they called me. And they said, all right, Samantha, there's something we don't like in the MRI. We'd like you to come back for a spot mammogram, which is a mammogram in a specific area. Came back for that. That led to a biopsy. And then I got a phone call. We found some cancerous cells. And that was my breast cancer diagnosis. Now, the scanxiety that people face, and I'm sure your listeners know about it, knowing that you have a possibility of having something pop up, that sucks. Let's just call it for what it is. Breast cancer is terrible. Breast cancer sucks. There's no other word for it. But knowing that you're called back, the anxiety, well, is it something? Is it nothing? That could be a calcification. It could be a cyst. It could be benign. It could be this, it could be that. That's what dissuades people from being on top of their health and getting their screening. And
the mental game of it, you mean?
Mental game. And for me, I just had to take a step back and say, okay, let's frame this. What are we talking about here? We're talking about something that could be a problem, or it could be nothing. And if it is a problem, it's not going to be woe is me, I have breast cancer. It's all right, I found it. I did what I needed to do for the past 10 years to make sure that I was on top of my health, and I found something. And so when she called me and said, we found some cancerous cells, I didn't slump over and start crying. I said to myself, I found it. I did it. And it was almost, it sounds crazy, but it was almost like I felt like I had power. I enabled myself to do something that my mother wasn't fortunate enough to do. Because back in 1988, we didn't talk about breast cancer. You couldn't see breast on television, about 6 years prior to that. It was only a conversation. Research hadn't even scratched the surface where we are today. And I thought to myself, wow, medicine has advanced. I'm on top of my stuff. And I was able to find this. And I lived that life. And I continued to live that life. And so I was diagnosed with DCIS, which is stage 0 breast cancer, which is where the cancer has not yet left the duct. That was the earliest possible time I could find it, and I did it. I had a mastectomy on my right to remove my right breast, and they also removed my left breast prophylactically, so that in the event that it was a recurrence, my recurrence chances went from somewhere in the 80s down to less than 2%. I was able to take my life into my own hands and do it on my terms. Now, every medical decision is a decision that people make personally. What I did for me is not necessarily the right answer for somebody else. But for me, I felt power in decision making, and I felt positivity I framed the situation in a positive way to really make that negative a learning experience. And I wanted that to be a learning experience for others. And so after my mastectomy, I'm sitting there and I'm like, what can I do with this journey? What can I do with this story?
Wait, in the bed, you're having this thought already?
No, I'm the type of person that I can't just sit and do nothing. And I'm sitting watching TV. I'm I post mastectomy a couple of days. I finally have movement in my arms. I went to a dry bar and I got my hair blown out, because when you have a mastectomy, you can't really lift your arms. So doing your hair isn't that easy to do. And I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to be all right. My cancer hadn't spread. I'm not going to have to go through chemotherapy and radiation like so many others have. And I said, it's early detection that did it. And so how do I use my experience for good? I felt like I wanted to give back. I joined the Pink Agenda, which is the most amazing organization. I'm on the executive board and help run the education committee, and began the speaker series where we reach thousands of women a year talking about health and wellness. And I felt that I needed to know more about the science behind why the things that I did actually physically felt empowering.
You mean the positive mindset, the reframing,
Yeah. And I decided, you know what, I need to learn more about it. And so I applied to the positive psychology master's program at Penn, and I studied under Marty Seligman, who's known as the father of positive psychology. And I realized all those things that I had lived were things that have science-based research as to why they give you a life with elevated well-being, with elevated quality of life. And I thought to myself, does that aid with risk? Does that aid with ultimate prognosis? The answer is yes.
I love all of it, because positive psychology, I think of, self-confidence, it is rooted in positive psychology. It shows up in all of it. But can you give, the Cliff's Notes version of what positive psychology is? I know that's a huge ask.
Simply put, it's the science of what makes life worth living. What makes you live with an elevated quality of life and well-being.
If we put together the two stories, the positive psychology and life post-diagnosis, that quality of life, that life worth living, can be found at any time, at any stage, no matter the circumstances, is really what I'm hearing you say.
100%. I mean, a breast cancer diagnosis is not just a quick and easy fix, because there's physical and then there's mental. And you might be diagnosed and it's a diagnosis of metastatic breast cancer, stage 4, where it's traveled to other parts of the body, and now this is a chronic illness. There's no cure for stage 4 breast cancer. But people live with it and people thrive with it. We call them thrivers. And I know so many beautiful, strong women who have been diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer that live their best life because they embrace those positive interventions that we talk about in positive psychology. There's the acronym PERMA, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, was coined by Marty Seligman, and it has 5 pieces to it that are really the ingredients of living a life with increased well-being. And what are these elements? We talk about PERMA. PERMA is positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. And I also like to add vitality. And so there's been a kind of rejigger of that acronym to revamp. And that was coined by Dr. Jordan Feingold, a colleague of mine. And what I love about it is that if we're looking to increase our well-being, our quality of life, oftentimes we have to revamp. And that includes vitality, which is so incredibly important. Vitality includes healthy eating, exercise, mindfulness. And so,
well, specifically, if you're talking about it from a medical lens, right? If we're looking at revamp as a solution to live your best life, your wholest life, even in the face of a diagnosis, I mean, vitality is so key, right? I mean,
key. Oh, so key. And at the Pink Agenda, we fund a number of researchers every year, one of which is Dr. Neil Iyengar out of Memorial Sloan Kettering. And his research directly focuses on the correlation between diet and exercise to risk and prognosis and survivorship. And because the correlation is so strong, number one thing to do when you're diagnosed with breast cancer is move, get out. They say 10,000 steps a day is what you need, 30 minutes of exercise. And it doesn't need to be running on a treadmill. It could just be walking with a friend,
totally.
Having those people around you that encourage that movement, that vitality, those exercises really can make a positive difference in your ultimate prognosis.
1,000%, proactively and reactively. I remember actually my first mammogram and visit after my sister's diagnosis. The majority of the conversation was actually about foods that I should be eating and incorporating into my diet. It wasn't, it was this very like proactive, holistic approach of like, we don't need to wait for a diagnosis to be taking really good care of our health. We also don't need to wait for a diagnosis to adapt this really positive, like living your fullest life and feeling those positive emotions, that meaning, those achievements, all of it.
Yeah. I mean, we say eat the rainbow, and broccoli and Brussels sprouts are your friends. Flax seeds are an amazing superfood. They should be sprinkled on everything. And they say red meat is something that we should try to limit. And we should understand what a portion size is. And having that education is important. They say less than 5 servings is what we need to stick to of red meat over a week period, because there are studies that show that there is an increase in risk of breast cancer when you have a high consumption of red meat. But when we're looking at a big steak, we have to remember that might be more than 1 serving, because a serving size of steak is about the size of your palm, maybe about a deck of playing cards. So when you go out for that New York strip, how many playing card decks are you seeing there?
Yeah.
But that's why I love the education of, my community, the people who are interested in learning about how they can stay well. And it's part of what I do with Pink Agenda Speaker Series, where we just talk to people about, there are things that you can't control. You can't control your family history. You can't control your genetics. You can't control that you're a born woman or man at birth. These are things that will elevate your risk. But what you can control is your exercise, your diet, the people who are around you who influence your behaviors. You can control your abstaining from alcohol and smoking, things that are known carcinogens that will increase risk. And having that control, remember how we're talking about having control? I feel like it's really important and empowering, because it's something that you can do to make yourself healthier and well. And that's why I love PERMA and revamp, because those are just the tools that you can follow to bring upon that healthy, well, best life that you want to live.
Totally. And I would assume, particularly on the heels of a diagnosis, when many feel so disempowered, so powerless, there is so much out of your control, even as you talk about that scan anxiety, You still have the opportunity to reframe those thoughts. You still have control over that and how you take care of your body, who you connect yourself with. Revamp is always within your control.
100%.
I love that. I love that. Let's talk a little bit about the R, because I was thinking, I have two thoughts. One, I love something you said at the beginning of how this is unique to everybody, right? Every person has their own journey to go on and gets to make their own choices. When my sister was diagnosed, and I know she wouldn't argue this, I knew exactly what she should do and how she should be doing it. And it's a lesson I'm still learning, right? But one of the things that I really thought was so important was the relationships and connection to others who know what you're going through. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like the Pink Agenda has been a source of that for you? Like what role does connection and community play for you in your survivorship?
I think the R is so important in Revamp. It's the number one, because I know that for me in my journey, if I didn't have those relationships, if I didn't have those positive people around me, not only, throughout my youth when I was being screened, but ultimately when I was diagnosed, and then, now 11 years later, I would be in a much different place. And with the Pink Agenda, I have surrounded myself with like-minded people who have been through something similar to myself. Some women are survivors, some are thrivers, still living with metastatic breast cancer. Some are previvors, where they have an elevated risk because they have a mother or a sister or grandmother who's been diagnosed. And others are caregivers who have experienced a loved one been diagnosed and they want to give back. And when I talk about those relationships and community, it brings a sense of what Emil Durkheim, a famous psychologist, once called collective effervescence. It's this fuel, it's this effervescence, bubbly feeling that you get when you're around people that have commonality. Somebody once described a Billy Joel concert where everybody's singing Piano Man. And you hear an entire concert hall singing with Billy Joel. And no matter who are the people around you, you all know the song and you're all singing along and you're all smiling and waving back and forth with each other. And there's this chill that goes down your spine.
I have a chill right now. I just showed Samantha on the camera my goosebumps, because even her just saying that, anyone else, listeners, I have a chill because you can feel it. You describing it, Samantha, I feel it in my body. I have goosebumps. Go on.
And you get goosebumps when you're around people that share something with you. Now, these are not people that you're not going to be best friends with. You're standing next to them at a concert and you'll never see them again. I like to call it single serving friends, a reference to Fight Club, where you see in person once, you have a moment with them and they go off on their merry way. But you feel that elevated sense of well-being when you're around them. So when I was diagnosed, I didn't know anybody who was 30 years old and have been diagnosed with breast cancer. Mm-hmm. And it was lonely for a minute. And a friend called me up and said, I have this friend. She was diagnosed when she was young too. Maybe you want to talk to her. And so I had my conversation with my husband. We were engaged at the time. And I had my conversations with my dad and the rest of my family about, how we'll deal with my breast cancer diagnosis. But then I talked to somebody who was not in it with me, but a little bit more remote, but can share their experience. And I found peace in a shared experience. And that was really, really important because it de-stressed me a bit. Yeah. It made me see that other people have gone through it. There's something about that.
100%. I think I say often, like when we suffer alone, we sometimes think we're the only ones suffering. But then when we are willing, again, to be vulnerable, or even, you had to pick up the phone to make that call or to accept that call, right? But when we're willing to do that, we're reminded, even in the hardest of times, we are connected. And humanity, those relationships, it's such a source of hope. And I mean, connection within itself is medicine.
Yeah. I mean, by nature, we are innately prone to want connection. You go back to, the origin of groups where our social instincts told us that when we were isolated, we're less likely to survive than when we're amongst others. And with reciprocity, when you give, you get, and you're more likely to do better because of that. Even babies instinctively know they need the sustenance of their mother and crave some contact to thrive. And so our physical bodies know that we need that connection. Our mind body comes together when we hear Piano Man and start to sing or even think about singing. I'll spare your audience my voice. But I think that having that commonality is super, super important. And there are studies that show that that feeling that we feel actually is a scientific reaction that enables us to reduce inflammation, reduce stress, increase well-being. And after having that conversation, the first one I had with that woman who had undergone breast cancer before me, it was like, okay, someone else has done this. I can do it too. And then when I became friends with my colleagues at the Pink Agenda, and they had been touched in various different ways, we felt power through community because we were able to do good. Our focus at TPA is to raise money and awareness for the disease. And we fund researchers. This year, we're so fortunate enough to fund 5 Breast Cancer Research Foundation researchers who are doing such amazing things. And we feel that as a team together, the collective, we're able to make such an impact. Now, the Pink Agenda is a young professionals organization. We're the young professional partner of the Breast Cancer Research Foundation. So for young people averaging about 35 to 40 years old, we can make a difference. And that also is empowering in itself.
Well, it speaks to the M of revamp or PERMA, right? Like, it's not just connection of sitting in a room, because for some people that might not be it, right? For some people, for me, right? Like support group and listening and loving, that is for me. It wasn't for my sister, right? But for some people to then use that connection to fuel meaning and achievement. And I'm sure that's what you get with TPA.
And that's why I feel like that relationship is so incredibly important, because it can ignite all those other aspects, relationships, meaning, achievement, all of those things that enter you in a state of flow that you find your purpose. And people always ask me, what do you do? And I'm like, I'm a lawyer. I contest people's real estate taxes and try to save them, save them in their real estate taxes in New York City. I file on 5,000 buildings. Does that fuel my soul? No, it saves people money. I like to think I'm one of the good lawyers, but what fuels my soul, what fills my cup is my philanthropy through TPA, to talk to people and to be that person now on the other side on that phone call, talking about a recent diagnosis and saying, you'll be okay. And I can't tell you, I maybe have one call a month, random friends that I haven't talked to in years, high school friends who see posts on Instagram or things that I share on social media. And they say, I have a friend who's been diagnosed. She's 35. She's got 2 children. Can you speak to her? Or I have a friend who's about to get married. She's been diagnosed. Can you point her in the right direction of some resources? And I feel like this survivorship club that we're in right now is one that is so altruistic. I never met a single person who's been diagnosed with breast cancer that didn't want to share their story or say me too. And there's power in that. 1 in 8 women will be diagnosed with breast cancer. So this is a big community, and we all know somebody.
Yeah.
So knowing that is really important. But you said something earlier about, the support groups and, involvement in different types of groups. The Pink Agenda, we raise money for research, and we're very active in our philanthropy through education. But there are lots of groups out there that you can be as active or passive as you want. And I spoke with a woman who started the Facebook page Beyond the Pink Moon. And she did this years and years ago. And there's just been lots of followers of all ages. And she talked about a lot of passive participants, people who were engaged in the community from a passive standpoint. And I thought that was really interesting, because just because you're not actively involved, like I run education with my colleague, Nicole Seagriff, and that's what I do. I'm there all the time. It's my second job. That's my passion. But there are people who are involved in organizations or social groups or chats that might not be an active participant, but they get the same, their cups are filled similarly, because they're able to grow and be pumped up by those shared experiences that others discuss.
Totally. And it speaks to that. I mean, and I love that point. And like I said, this is truly a lesson that I'm continuing to learn. As a coach, one of the things I always have to learn, I don't know better than my clients. I will never know what the right thing for my client is to do. As a sister, as a mother, as a wife, let me tell you, I know what everyone should be doing. But that I tease, right? But it's a lesson that I'm still learning. Survivorship is not one size fits all. Community is not one size fits all. Your definition of meaning is not one size fits all. But Samantha, what I love what you said is, this is how I fill my cup. And because you fill your cup, you are then able to fill others. And it is such a beautiful thing. And then knowing that your cups that you are out there filling are fueled by these positive emotions, by this desire to help people achieve and find meaning and, support their own vitality. It's just such a beautiful thing.
I find it to be very fulfilling, and I hope that I do impact others. That's sort of the end goal, to make sure that people are able to learn and grow. And, I had my experiences and I lived my journey, and everybody lives their own journey. And how can we live together and encourage each other to live great lives? And
I love it. So in the spirit of encouraging people, how would you encourage those that have a loved one who is either, at the beginning of a diagnosis or on the other side of it? I like I said, my sister shared her story in the midst of it. She was on this screen with me, bald head and the strongest mindset she could write revamp, right?
She sounds like a rock star.
She is. But I will tell you, I think on the other side of it, there's not enough talk about that.
Very good point. I think that the before and after is very different for both the individual going through it and the family. Because I always say a diagnosis of an individual is not just a diagnosis of that individual, but it's a diagnosis of everybody who is around them, that loves them and cares for them. And so I'll answer your questions in a couple different parts, but with regard to a diagnosis and how to support somebody and what to do and how to be, I think that it's largely dependent on everybody's journey and how they are receptive. Some people don't want to talk about it, and so a good caregiver, a good loved one will just do what they can to distract, or do what they can to make things more positive in different ways. Not everybody, when you get diagnosed with breast cancer, you don't want to talk about breast cancer all the time.
Sure.
And sometimes when you see people and they're like, oh, how are you doing? It's like the first thing that comes up, the elephant in the room, so to speak. And so really knowing how that person wants to live their life. Do they want to talk about it? Do they feel it's important to vent constantly? That's important. But then there's an emotional exhaustion that comes with that.
Sure.
And talking about cancer is not a fun thing. And so as a caregiver, I think that, or loved one, just being there for that person in the way that they want to have their loved ones be there for them.
I love that. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about what's going on in your treatment right now, or do you want to talk about The Bachelor? And different people serve different purposes. And there's also that strange dynamic where you as a loved one also are going through this diagnosis as the loved one, right? And so you're coming at it with a slightly interested perspective, right? And so you have your opinions on how she should do things, and that's wonderful. Sometimes the person who's been diagnosed wants to speak to somebody who's a little bit more, or has less of an interest.
Yeah, she did not want my opinions. That's why I said it was a lesson I'm learning. She did not want them.
But some people do. And I think that's important, just understanding who wants what direction. I always say to my friends when they're in a bad mood, do you want to talk about it or do you want a distraction? And that's important because sometimes you will ultimately heal based upon and you'll ultimately heal in a better way depending on how you choose to heal. Yeah. Not by what somebody tells you to. And so if you want to be distracted by some reality TV show versus talking about the fact that your treatment stopped working, these are things that we need to consider when talking to our loved one. But I think it's also as a caregiver or somebody who's been impacted as a secondary source, how do you handle that diagnosis mentally? Because we want to make sure that that person also is able to give their best self to their loved one who needs the support at that time. And so being able for that person who hasn't been diagnosed to vent to somebody else who's a non-interested party is always important. And so when I talk to people in that initial conversation, I always say, do you have a support system? And they always say I have a husband or I have best friends. And I think that's so important to have that primary support system circle. But then you have your secondary, which is your community, right? Your friends, people who've been introduced to, who've gone through it, organizations, support groups, things like that. They have a different relationship with you. And so you can be one person going through treatment or one person being the caregiver amongst one subset of people, and then that other within another subset. I'm not going to cry and bear my entire, life story to a stranger. Then I'll talk about my diagnosis and how much it sucked and what do I want to do different, because they're going to give me a non-biased perspective.
Right. Yeah. Less skin in the game.
Mm-hmm. And then we talk about after treatment and after you're still in survivorship. Like I've been in survivorship for 11 years. I will always be a breast cancer survivor and it will always be top of mind. I see my nurse practitioner every March, and I see my plastic surgeon to make sure that these things are still intact every September. And I always know that there is a lump or a bump or something that feels good. I have to make that phone call immediately because there is a likelihood of recurrence that I don't like, right? I know too many people who have had recurrences. And so mentally, I need to know that, there are people around me that are also going through this. Because, when I was diagnosed, I got people sent me flowers. They sent me meals when I was going through surgery. And you have the treatment period where people are there for you. And then you forget about that mental part later on where there's a fear. It's like that scanxiety, but instead of it being a scanxiety, not wanting to get a mammogram because you're afraid what's going to be there, or not wanting to get your secondary screening because they found something that may or may not be bad. Now you're looking at, will my cancer come back? And if it does, is it going to come back more aggressive? And am I going to have a problem, a life-threatening problem?
Yeah.
So,
and that's where that reframing and that positive emotion probably serves you so much on that other side as well. With Laura too, I also noticed, to speak, you so beautifully offered the two lenses. With Laura, when she was cancer-free and rang that bell, I think all of us who loved her so much and, had been holding our breath, we just took this collective sigh of relief. We're like, whew, that's over. Yeah. And for her, a new chapter had really begun. And I was so thankful for her for bringing that to me, and then the opportunity to bring it here of like, it and to your point, forever in survivorship. And it is a continuation.
And we take that information as a survivor and we do what we want with it. We know that we have faced something that has been horrible and we've gotten through it, and we might come back stronger on the other side and apply the things that we learned throughout that journey to our life, trying to live it in whatever way we want to live. Other people come out like myself and, all right, now what can I do? There are different ways of handling it. And for me, I have to be able to do something. But, living the best life you can is the best thing you can do. So there's just different ways of going through it.
Well, Samantha, I love that. And I can't think of a better way to close out the show than living your best life. But as we do, anything else you want to add?
Just actually one other thing, and I didn't get to touch on it before, but one of the things that I love about having community, being around people who have shared experiences, is that, especially in the breast cancer world, is that it gives you hope. It gives you this perspective that the people around you are living and thriving and doing good things with their lives. And in my organization, where we're all, having the goal of raising money and what we call raising a little hell in the fight against breast cancer, we are surrounded by people who are living years beyond where doctors had said that they were going to, because treatments are working. if somebody's been diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer, they can see that there are other people that have lived for 8, 10, 20, 30 years after diagnosis. And people can thrive with a diagnosis. And being around community like that, seeing those examples of those thrivers that have really taken their life and been receptive to treatments and lived, that gives hope. There's hope in community. And then with research, I see every day new studies, new medicines, new screening techniques. And these are the things that give me hope. Because I have a daughter, she's 8 years old, and she's going to have that elevated risk that I did. And the Pink Agenda and other organizations that raise money for research, they're going to find treatments and screening and the cure that I know will be there for my daughter. And so that's why I do this.
I lied. That's the best way to close out the show. Hope and a world where our daughters are living where there's a cure. So yes. Samantha, thank you. Thank you to the Pink Agenda for the work that you do and the research that you fund and the advances that you're helping make, and for using your voice. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the time.
All right, my friends. Till next time.
Love what you hear? Well, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me at confidencecoachforgirls.com. That's confidencecoachforgirls.com. Or email me at lesliethelifecoach@gmail.com. That's lesliethelifecoach@gmail.com. Hope to hear from you.